Welcome to the Wheel of Knowledge by Dr. Naved Akbar. Let's dive right into today's explainer, where we're decoding the truly fascinating blueprint of life. We're going to take a really deep, but totally easy to understand look at the principles of inheritance and variation. Basically, we're going to break down exactly how traits get passed on from one generation to the next.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the mystery of heredity, Mendel's genetic breakthrough, the laws of inheritance, beyond simple dominance, human genetics and pedigrees, and finally, mutations in the DNA.
Section 1. The Mystery of Heredity, an Early Human Understanding. We're actually starting our journey today, not in some high-tech modern lab filled with microscopes, but thousands of years in the past. Honestly, it's incredible to think about, but humans were selectively breeding plants and animals for desirable traits as early as 8000 BC. That is way before we even knew what a cell was, let alone a gene. We were practically geneticists before we even invented the word. You see, our ancestors recognized that sexual reproduction was the key to variation. They actively exploited the natural differences they saw in wild populations of plants and animals. But the thing is, they didn't have the scientific mechanism to explain it. It wasn't until the 1800s that a monk named Gregor Mendel began the very first systematic study of this whole phenomenon.
So the first concept we really need to nail down is the definition of inheritance. It's the strict biological process by which characters are passed from parent to progeny. It is quite literally the absolute basis of heredity. This is the exact fundamental mechanism that keeps apple trees from suddenly producing oranges and ensures elephants only ever give birth to elephants.
But, just as important as inheritance is this concept of variation. This perfectly explains why you don't look exactly like a clone of your parents or identical to your siblings. Variation measures the degree to which progeny actually differ from those parent organisms. It really is the spice of life, giving us the immense, beautiful diversity we see out there in nature.
Moving on to Section 2. Mendel's genetic breakthrough, the rules of the game. So Gregor Mendel studied pea plants for years, and through that, he realized that traits are controlled by these stable, discrete units he called factors. Now, today we call these genes. And these genes have variations, which we know as alleles. Think of alleles as slightly different forms of the exact same recipe. Mendel brilliantly illustrated this idea by assigning alphabetical symbols. For example, he used a capital T to represent a dominant tall trait in a pea plant, and a lowercase t for a recessive dwarf trait.
Since alleles always come in pairs, an organism's genetic makeup basically falls into one of two main buckets. If an organism happens to have two identical alleles, like, say, two capital T's or two lowercase t's, it's called homozygous. We refer to these as true breeding pairs. But if it inherits one of each, meaning it's got a capital T and a lowercase t, it is heterozygous. That's a hybrid containing contrasting traits. To actually map all of this out mathematically, there was this British geneticist named Reginald C. Punnett who developed this beautiful graphical tool we call the Punnett square. It lets us predict the sequential math of reproduction. So, step 1, parents produce gametes which carry one allele each. Step 2, those gametes unite to form a zygote. Step 3, that zygote develops into the first generation, which we call F1. And step 4, and honestly, this is the really amazing part. A recessive trait that completely vanished in that F1 generation can just suddenly re-emerge later in the F2 generation.
Okay, now this next part is super interesting. It's called a test cross. A test cross is basically a visual, experimental method used to determine the exact hidden genetic makeup of an organism that's showing a dominant trait. So imagine you have a purple flower. You know for a fact it has a dominant purple allele, but is it homozygous or heterozygous? Well, by crossing it with a homozygous recessive white flower, the resulting offspring act as a sort of genetic lie detector, revealing the exact hidden makeup of that parent.
Which brings us to Section 3, the laws of inheritance, consolidating the science.
Based on all of these observations, Mendel laid down some definitive ground rules for biology. The absolute biggest one, the law of dominance. It dictates that in a mismatched pair of genes, one dominant factor is always going to completely overshadow the other. The recessive trait doesn't just blend in, it actually just quietly hides in the background until the exact right homozygous conditions are met in a later generation.
Section 4. Beyond simple dominance, the plot twist. But, as we know, nature absolutely loves throwing us a curveball. What happens if neither trait fully wins out? Take the snapdragon plant, for example. Here, a modified allele produces a less efficient or maybe completely non-functional enzyme.
So, when you cross a true breeding red flower with a true breeding white flower, you don't actually get a dominant red. Instead, you get a completely pink F1 generation. It is this perfectly blended flower color, simply because one allele is only incompletely dominant over the other.
And you know, unlike Mendel's strictly tall or dwarf pea plants, human traits, like height for example, are governed by something called polygenic inheritance. This just means that multiple genes are working together. Human height spreads across this wide, continuous curve, rather than falling into distinct buckets. You end up with a low frequency of very short people, a massive high frequency of average height people, and a low frequency of very tall people. It's entirely a spectrum.
All right, Section 5. Human Genetics and Pedigrees, Tracing Our Roots.
Let's bring this concept directly home to us. Obviously, we can't do controlled breeding experiments on humans, so pedigree analysis acts as our very own powerful genetic detective tool. By utilizing these standard symbols, squares for males, circles for females, and shaded shapes for individuals affected by a specific trait, we can trace abnormalities or inherited diseases backward through generations of a family tree. It completely allows geneticists to figure out if a dangerous disease is dominant, recessive, or perhaps just being carried silently by perfectly healthy parents.
Finally, Section 6, Mutations in the DNA, Alterations to the Blueprint.
So, what actually happens when the very code of life makes a mistake? Usually, DNA is transmitted with incredible, mind-blowing accuracy, completely unchanged. But an occasional alteration, which we call a mutation, can absolutely occur. This drastically modifies the information that a particular allele contains, and this unexpected change in the genetic material is exactly what leads to numerous genetic disorders in human beings. It changes the instructions, which ultimately changes the physical outcome.
To kind of tie this whole journey together today, you always want to remember this absolutely vital distinction: genotype versus phenotype. Your genotype is the invisible instruction manual. It's the specific genetic factors and alleles securely locked away on your chromosomes. Your phenotype, on the other hand, is the physical expression of those characters. It's the actual building that was constructed from the blueprint.
There's this fantastic quote from the text that I think brilliantly captures the entire essence of biology. DNA is the carrier of genetic information. It is hence transmitted from one generation to the other. It really is this continuous, unbroken chain of information that links you, right now, to the ancient humans of 8000 BC and even far beyond. You are, quite literally, the current custodian of an ancient, ongoing genetic library.
So as you sit there thinking about the genes you possess, what hidden variations might you be carrying around in your own genotype? Thank you so much for expanding your mind today and exploring the principles of inheritance and variation with The Wheel of Knowledge by Dr. Naved Akbar. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you in the next explainer.